to get.
Got it. Pause.
Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to see you all here tonight for our webinar on women in the American Revolution. And it's being led by Marianne de Padua from the New York Historical Society. And I hope you're all ready to get very engaged, because she's got a wonderful pedagogical and content full presentation ready for you tonight. So I'm gonna, without further ado, I'm gonna turn the time over to Marianne.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this evening. We'll be together for the next hour and exploring resources from the New York Historical Society. And I invite you all to use the chat to engage with me, to talk with each other, and we'll be using a few other platforms to talk about the resources that I hope you use right away, to be honest. So here we go. This is a picture of the museum in New York. It is the first museum in New York, actually. Have any of you ever heard of the New York Historical Society, or maybe have been to New York and seen it? You can let me know in the chat. Oh, great. From Anita, you have wonderful Amy. Oh, you're in Brooklyn. Hello. I'm in Washington Heights, so we are kind of far from each other, but hello, New York. Great. So welcome everyone to this learning community. I want to start with a land acknowledgement as well, that the New York Historical Society is located on unceded indigenous land called Lenape-Hoking, home of the Munsee Lenape, to whom we give honor. To learn more about the land you are on, I encourage you to visit Native Land Digital. You can scan the QR code for the link. Oops. And I also want to give you all the resources for this evening, which includes the Native Land Digital link. Thank you, Laura, for adding that into the chat. And so this is what it looks like. All of the links at the top are ways to stay in touch with the curriculum, Women in the American Story, to use it, to sign up, to hear more about it. The workshop links, I will be referring to them throughout the session. The bullet point that says slides after our workshop, I will go ahead and PDF my slides, link those in the document, and you will have access to everything that I share with you. All right, so please use this. And our next slide, I just want us all to take a moment to review the group norms as we are a learning community this evening. Okay, can we agree to these norms as a group this evening? Can write yes in the chat. Absolutely is awesome too. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Okay. So before we dive into the resources, I want to tell you what WAMS is. Whether you've heard of it or not, we hope at the New York Historical Society that this is useful for all of you, and in addition to all of the wonderful resources you are already using in your curriculum. So it is a free curriculum website created by the museum, and it aims to connect educators like yourselves with classroom resources that illuminate diverse women's contributions to the American past. WAMS really began to address this statistic. On the screen, it says only 13% of historical figures in textbooks are women. Often the history we have heard of women is relegated to the suffrage movement or the domestic sphere. And WAMS shows that it is far more complex than that, that women have operated at all levels of society. And you are just going to get a few resources that show that from a particular unit. And WAMS while we are based in New York, it is meant to be adaptable for all standards across the country. So it is very flexible. By this November, I'm proud to say that we will have 10 chronological units out. So it starts with 1492 and early encounters. And even though the last unit says it'll go till 2018, it'll actually conclude around 2004, which isn't to say that we are done. We are always going back to revisit the content to make sure that new scholarship is included in the units we've already published. So it is always in progress, always in phases. Right now we have 8 units. Period, the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's really very thorough, all of our units and sections. Each unit includes primary source images, objects, and documents. When you registered, you were provided links to the life stories, mini biographies written for a middle school to high school level, though you can adapt it even further, and there are rich images for students, especially for those in the early elementary grades. We have STEM integration, art activities, and I also want to shout out that this is a collective effort, that we have institutions across the country who are generous with the resources they share with us that are included in WAMS. And the resources are meant to be classroom ready. So the first example on this slide is actually a resource we are looking at this evening. So if you're talking about protests leading up to the American Revolution, there is a document you can use alongside of the Boston Tea Party resources. If you're thinking about the Dust Bowl, we have an image of a wife of a Mexican sharecropper near Bryan, Texas. And you're able to include multiple perspectives and multiple resources. And that's what WAMS does. It gives all of that to you in one really organized way. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in the settler colonialism and the American Revolution unit. And of course, our section in particular is the American Revolution. For every unit and section, we have key ideas, essential questions. We have discussion questions at the end of every resource. We have done the work for you, and these are all suggestions that you can apply into your classroom practice right away. So for tonight, I want us to think about how women played critical roles in every part of the American Revolution, from the early protests through managing the aftermath of the war. And every part doesn't necessarily mean championing the American Revolution. It could also mean resisting the revolution as well. We have 2 essential questions for this evening. How can learning about the experiences of women involved in the American Revolution help students gain a deeper understanding of their roles and contributions to the founding of the United States? How can using primary sources and strategies from this workshop support teaching the American Revolution in accessible, sensitive, and culturally responsive ways? So how do we take everything that our students know and add that into the conversation? Also, it's okay if our students are just learning this. For your elementary school students, in New York, the youngest that we start to teach the complexities of the revolution is 4th grade, but I've explained it to students even younger, and even an image can go a long way to explaining this, the founding of the country. A couple of notes about terminology for our session. Many resources that we will be working with, particularly the life stories, tell histories of oppression, violence, and brutality against Black communities. To center the humanity of this group, please use African American, Black person, Black man, Black woman, Black child, Black communities in our discussions, and the term enslaved person rather than slave. Now I would like us to create a word cloud together using the platform Mentimeter. It is a free platform where you can get a subscription to it. In your workshop links document, there is the link to contribute a couple words to this question. what comes to mind when you think of women in the American Revolution? So as you are doing that, I'm going to head to the screen. So once you click on the link, this is what you will see. And then let me present it. As you write your word, you will see it populate. You also have the option to contribute words in the chat. We're seeing undervalued, hidden, less, Molly Pitcher, brave, relentless. Strong, vital, disenfranchised, hidden, torn, grit. Courage. Any other words? Looks like brave is the word most added. Absolutely. What I am noticing, oh, you have letters, dutiful. What I am noticing is that we have named Molly Pitcher, and when I was a student as well, that is who I think of when I consider women in the American Revolution. And after this, you'll have so many women you can name for your students. Underappreciated, yes, these are all very accurate of how a lot of teachers that I've worked with on this topic have felt. So you are in conversation with them too with these words. And I will add this as a JPEG in the slides. Okay. So with our resources, I always ask, how do we even begin to guide our students to looking at images of the revolution, especially our early elementary, especially our middle schoolers, all of our students. And at the Historical Society, we are very much champions of the 3 steps. So we encourage not only students, but adult learners to use these 3 guiding steps. I will guide you through what we call an inquiry, visual inquiry exercise. And the first step is always to observe, which is the most crucial step, but can be the hardest. If you think about a student who knows so much and wants to share, this is a step where everyone can slow down. The experience becomes more equitable, more liberating, because you're basing it in what you see. The second step is to interpret what those details mean. And then the last step is to draw your conclusions. It can be as simple as, what does this tell you about people long ago, to what does this tell you about the purpose of the American Revolution or the role of women? So it can be scaled up or adapted to be very age appropriate. Okay, so our first resource, I would like you to not say anything in the chat and just let your eyes wander. Think about what you are seeing for a few seconds. Okay, so there are a couple of ways to do this in person, but we'll do this in the chat. In person, you can have every student say one thing they see and one different thing, and you can write this on, on a chart paper, whichever you like. But what we're going to do, I'm just going to have you add into the chat one thing that you are noticing. fire. Mhm. There are children there, two men fighting, indigenous family up front. Okay, so to the left, ropes around the statue being pulled down. It's always a moment where you can have your students reenact that. Smoke, fighting, statue has a crown, women holding hands, women as bystanders. Okay, can you tell me, Julia, what makes you say that? What is the evidence in this image that tells you they are bystanders? And David, how do you know they are a family? What clues in the image do you see? If you have any more observations, you can keep adding. We're seeing indigenous folks and colonists. How do we know they are indigenous? How do we know they're colonists? What details tell you that? Okay, Samuel, we see Brace. Julia, they seem to be more focused on children, the women with their hands clasped, but not seem to be as engaged as others. The clothing gives us a sign of who they are, their status in society. Different classes of people. How do we know that, Andrew? So Paula, we see headdress and clothing really signifying who our indigenous family is. We see a sunset. So, okay, so I'm hearing that all of you are really looking at the details of the clothing and deciding the relationship between these people. Fantastic. Cynthia, I didn't see it as the statue being pulled down. I saw the lines as drawing attention of the man on the horse toward those beneath it. Interesting. Mary Lee, the women are in the light while others are more obscured. Yeah. There's so much to say about this painting. Obviously, our theme tonight is women in the American Revolution. Heidi, some people see concern or appalled and others seem to be encouraging what is happening, such as the people sitting on the other side in the background. Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of different emotions. We have called out women, of course. So let us focus even more on that because there's so much happening. I did a workshop where I focused on a different section of this painting every single day. So we are going to look at the women in the right-hand corner. So we went through this step. So our observations, what do you see, notice? Talk to me about the women in the painting. So how about this one, really looking at the women? What other details stand out to you about them and what emotions are you seeing from them specifically? Concern, yeah. Anything else? Thank you, Jim. Bewilderment. Confusion. Anything else? Fear. Maybe not so much concern, but disbelief. Okay, so women were not present at this event. This event is the pulling down the statue of King George III in 1776. And personal firsthand accounts said that there were men, white men, Black sailors, merchants who had been part of and there were soldiers in the Continental Army who had heard a reading of the Declaration of Independence. And there was this surge of passion. They were very inspired. This was a moment of revolution. It was official. And they went to the southernmost part of Manhattan by the harbor. It's called Bowling Green to this day. And there was this statue of King George III that was pulled down. So yes, we have various people portraying opposing emotions, but a lot of these people were not there, specifically women. So when we think about that, the artist, Ortel, why do you think he included women in this depiction? And he's painting this way after the event. Any thoughts on that? to show that this event affected everyone. Yes, definitely one interpretation to convey the idea that everyone was on board with the revolution. Yes, and yet all of you didn't provide an answer that was unifying of what emotions you were seeing. There were so many different ones that you noticed. It's an effort to show unity, that all people were involved. Maybe he wanted to include all of the key players from the time period, yeah, to influence citizens to be more inclined to support women's suffrage, show women were part of our founding, yeah. To seem like less rabble-rousing. Could you expand on that, Jennifer? Julie, to give legitimacy to the tearing down of the statue, yes, because then it led to so many things, like a new government being formed, a really unique government being formed in a time of monarchies. Yeah. So there's a lot to say about this. The painting was also completed in 1853. So I want to put it out there. What is in the timeline of US history, what's about to happen when Ortel completes this painting in 1853? The Civil War, yeah. So he's looking at an event. It hasn't been quite 100 years since then, but he is looking back at this. So in this way, it's actually a secondary source to an actual event, merely also to legitimize the act and make it seem more palatable with the children being there. Yeah, it's a family scene when families were not there. Ortel was a German immigrant. So at the time, 1850s, German immigrants were the largest wave of one of the largest wave, along with Irish immigrants, at least in New York City. Yeah, and it is in our collection. This painting is incredible. It's one of our classics, if you will. And there are so many details that you cannot really see online, but it is such a great way to show it through a remote setting. And when you click on the link, you can actually download pieces of it to show in an activity for your students. And just give them corners and pieces of it before giving them the whole very expansive painting. Right, so Ortel is making a statement about who this moment impacted. So we see, just so you all are aware, our native family, our indigenous family, very much in the shadows, to show that, you know, by this point in time, there had been such a removal, there was so much, essentially a genocide of indigenous communities. And so he's really making a case of, you know, what is the status of those who called this land home. Women, we can see that there is the triangular formation, heavily used in Renaissance painting, so can give us a sense of their class status. Another triangle here underneath the statue. It's a bit hard to see, but you can see a Black man at the bottom towards the ground. So whether enslaved or not, there was a free Black population. We cannot specify. And then, you know, the merchant business class. Okay, so a couple of questions left. Which women are missing from this image? Mary Lee, the women in the picture seem to have more status than this indigenous families, Native Americans, with them being in the lights. Yeah, so we are missing Black women, enslaved women. We are also missing in full light at the forefront indigenous women's experiences in the revolution. Poor women, yeah, so we can't actually, I mean, I was thinking today maybe the woman with the hat holding the child is being depicted as a caretaker or a lower class woman, but we can't actually distinguish that. Kim, German immigrant artists are representing the revolution from different perspectives. Interesting. I want to know more about that. Yeah, what do I know about that? I know, oh man, you're testing me here. I used to know that from working at the Tenement Museum, but at this moment it's kind of escaping me. But yeah, there were a lot of German immigrants who had fled wars, had fled really the reorganization of what is now the German state. So the country of Germany. So it is really interesting to think about who is commenting on the revolution and in what way. And finally, what can this image tell us about the role of women in the colonies at the onset of the American Revolution? What are you learning about, at least how they're depicted here? Not active in the events. It's hard to say it was painted decades later by someone who wasn't there. That's absolutely valid. But this is an interpretation. What resource, who did he speak to about understanding the role of women, or did he even go that far? They are more of an afterthought, being protected, being shielded. Yeah, although involved, they were not part of the revolution, not active participants, more so bearing witness. But we are going to see in the next sources, there is a lot that women did on the home front and the war front as well. And this is the actual tale that we have in our collection that was saved by loyalists when the statue was indeed pulled down. And then if you are, for our friend in Brooklyn, you might already know what this is. For folks who are out of state, I hope you visit New York City, this is Bowling Green Park where the event is commemorated. Okay, so now we are going to take some time to look at how women were indeed active in the American Revolution, or at least in the lead up to it in this source. You might have heard of the Boston Tea Party, of course, but there was also the Edenton Tea Party. I believe the fountain is where the statue was, or approximately. All right, so this resource, it is a document. So we have always in our resources, the document text and then the summary on the other side. So in your workshop links doc, it is linked in there already if you would like to see it. Here is how I've formatted it. Take a moment to read the summary and then I will read the original document text to you. So I'll give you a few seconds. All right. So I will share this with you and then you're gonna spend a bit of time just reflecting on it through the platform Padlet, and I'll demonstrate how you can write your responses to these questions I have. Okay, so in Edenton, North Carolina on October 25th, 1774, as we cannot be indifferent on any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country, and as it has been thought necessary for the public good to enter into several particular resolves by a meeting of members deputed from the whole province, it is a duty which we owe not only to our near and dear connections who have concurred in them, but to ourselves who are essentially interested in their welfare, to do everything as far as lies in our power to testify our sincere adherence to the same. And we do therefore accordingly subscribe this paper as a witness of our fixed intention and solemn determination to do so. So I realize the text can be very challenging, but that is also why we have included the summary. Perhaps this could be an entry point for middle school students. You can start with the summary and then go to the document. So I have 3 questions for you. And if you look at your workshop links document, thank you, Laura, for adding the Padlet in there. So WAMS resource, the Edenton Tea Party. So this is what it looks like. There's a really awesome image of the newspaper it's published in. And then the Padlet, so it is linked in the Padlet as well, the resource, just hover above the picture. Question 1, what resources do the Edenton Ladies Patriotic Guild give for their support of the boycott? What can this source tell us about how women were affected by and experienced the American Revolution? And how might you use this resource with your students? What would you modify? And so this is the call to boycott tea. So how did these women react to it? To respond, you're going to click on the plus sign in the circle. You'll get a text box. You can write your response, and then all you have to do is click publish and it'll show up. You can also heart folks' comments. You can write comments to engage with what people have responded with. So I will leave this on the screen. Give you, oh, see where you are in 3 minutes, 5 minutes, excuse me. And you always have the option to respond using pen and paper. That is never off the table. Okay, everybody. Let's come back together. I love that you were all hearting responses, especially for question 3, how would you use this resource? So let's look at that Padlet right now. Okay, so I saw one comment about using the image for an I see, I think, I wonder. That is always a great way to introduce a historic source like this one to younger students. That activity about having students write the summary and then showing them the summary as a way to check their work was really great. And then for questions 1 and 2 about the reasons for supporting this boycott, I thought was really interesting. A lot of it is going to be with the focus of supporting the men. And at that point, it makes so much sense because women at that point were not seen as actual political agents, as people, as those who had legal rights, unless it was given by the men in their lives, fathers or their husbands. And so it is really interesting to consider, where can women be agents of change at this time, or be activists, or at least speak up for what they're believing in. And in this way, it is through the men. So does anyone else want to add anything to the chat about the Edenton Tea Party resource? And what I was referring to about women not having legal rights is something called coverture. I'll actually add that into the resource and stocks after tonight. It's actually a legal code of women being covered under the men. Okay, well done, everybody. And now we are going to, or we've looked at a resource that looks at white women's perspectives of the revolution, and now move into what the revolution meant for Black women. And the resource is called Abolition and Revolution. So we're going to do a quick image inquiry. Tell me, what details stand out to you in this image? She is writing. Yes. Anything else? Words around the image. So, Nicholas, you said most Black women in 1773 would not have known how to write, but what are you, so you are seeing a Black woman who is writing. Yeah, so we can keep it there, though I want to come back to your comment once we get to the next steps. She's looking towards something well-dressed. Okay, so my next set of questions, and I'll catch up with the chat. What is this person doing? Who might this person be? How can you tell? She seems deep in thought, thoughtfully writing. It's a Black woman with a pen in her hand, the audacity. African-American women writing, which was likely illegal back then, published according to an act of Parliament. Okay, so we're saying Parliament. Could that mean about where this image was published? She looks very thoughtful, well-dressed. Seems to be contemplating something, looking for the perfect words to write. So in this way, we can say that she is a writer. She's educated, she's well-dressed, so maybe she has a bit of money, or at least she's able to buy a nice outfit. And this is actually from a book. So what might this tell you about this writer? That her image is on a book in 1773. It's published in London. Would that audience be more receptive to this idea? She is actually not enslaved in London. She is free, because when an enslaver in the United States, goes to London and brings the person enslaved with them. I forget the exact details, it's in the resource, but Phyllis Wheatley, who we are seeing, was able to use the legal system and emancipate. So she very much is in England, at least she lived there for a time. Jim, what tells you that maybe perhaps this is trying to convey the idea that slavery was not so terrible? That's an interesting thing to consider. And, you know, from Phyllis Wheatley's Enslavers, there is something to that that we can explore. The first African-American women to be published, yeah. So if we ground it in Phyllis Wheatley's perspective, in her experience, right? We are going to look at a letter that she has written that includes a poem as well. So before all that, my last question, you know, if you didn't know who Phyllis Wheatley was, and you only had this image to go off of, what might we learn about her, and how might she have used her talents for abolitionist causes? Wendy, she's looking up as if recalling a memory she may want to write about. Yeah. And this is Phyllis Wheatley front piece from poems on various subjects, religious and moral. It's a book of her writings, which is such a big deal. It's a letter to John Wheatley, maybe her husband. Phyllis Wheatley, black servant to, so Mr. John Wheatley is actually the person who had enslaved her. And, you know, despite them supporting, the Wheatley household supporting her education, her writing, they did not free Phyllis, which is why she used the legal system in England to emancipate herself. Okay, so we see a very thoughtful person. George Washington held her high in regard. As someone who was formerly enslaved, she would be able to speak to the masses. Yeah, she has a platform. So I want to just share an excerpt from her letter. And similarly to the Edenton Tea Party, you know, it is somewhat challenging, but I think this excerpt in particular will give us a sense of what she is hoping to convey to Mary Wooster, the widow of General Wooster who died in the Revolution. So I actually just want to give you a few seconds to read this silently on your own before I read it aloud. Okay, as I read it, it's going to have you think about these two questions. How did Phyllis Wheatley use the ideals of the revolution to argue against slavery? And what does this poem reveal about the attitudes of enslaved and free Black persons during the American Revolution? I think it's always really important to not only give students a chance to read it on their own, but also to hear it, as it might land differently when spoken aloud. So, oh, still propitious be thy guardian care, and lead Columbia through the toils of war. With thine own hand conduct them and defend, and bring the dreadful contest to an end. Forever grateful let them live to thee, and keep them virtuous, brave, and free. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the almighty mind? While yet, O deed ungenerous, they disgrace, and hold in bondage Africa's blameless race. Let virtue reign, and those accord our prayers be victory ours, and generous freedom theirs. So what is she saying? What is she saying about slavery and the revolution? Or rather, the ideals of the revolution and then the reality of slavery happening in a time of revolution. Yeah, the dichotomy, the contradiction between the two, that slavery is very bad, is wrong, and yet we are in this, they're in this conflict where the ideals from the Enlightenment, the idea that all men are created equal, right, is not applying to people that look like Phyllis. Kim, that perhaps the colonists in their own obligations and trials with the Crown Parliament, that maybe they will come out of the revolution ready to create an equitable society, seeing that we are all created equal. Yeah, that was the hope of many enslaved Black communities. The fighting for freedom, yet don't see the problem with enslaving a race. Yes, and there was a lot of conversations on the American end of what to do. And actually, there was in 1775, Lord Dunmore's proclamation that said any enslaved person who self-emancipated and went to New York, which was occupied by the British for all of the war, if they fought for the crown, they would then be given their freedom. And in the Phyllis Wheatley resource, it does link to, and then in the life stories, Deborah Squash and Peggy Quinn, it does link to what happens, which is those in New York who self-emancipated were not returned to slavery, at least a good number of them. She feels it is morally reprehensible. Yeah. Okay, so here is an activist, here is a writer using her platform and art to really, as someone said, speak to the masses about this contradiction. It's a really fascinating resource. She is both a businesswoman saying, hey, Mary Wooster, your husband said he'd sell my books. Sorry, I'm send my condolences, but Phyllis still wants to sell those books so she can make a living. She is an abolitionist. She is a poet. So there's so much. It's so rich, that resource. Kim, I think there is an idea here that Black Americans were looking at this from a spectator's perspective, looking to see what they would do, how they would respond. In so many ways, I mean, with Phyllis Wheatley's activism and then and then Black soldiers who were fighting, it was definitely not a role of being just witnesses and spectators. From the onset, it was always going to be the activism of Black communities for full freedom. So thank you for bringing that into the space. All right, so the final activity, the life stories that you were asked to read that you now have, I'm just going to give you a few minutes, let's say 5 minutes, to respond to the questions on the Padlet. And you are also welcome to use this even after the session today. So I will leave this screen up, but the Padlet, thank you for adding that, has the link to all of the life stories here. And what you will do, just pick the life story that you read, and then you can answer these 3 questions. What was this person's experience of the revolution? What does this story add to our understanding about the American Revolutionary War? And how and why should this resource be integrated into your classroom practice? What would you modify? And go ahead and start reflecting, and I will leave this on the screen. Hi, Samuel. So you're not responding about Phyllis Wheatley. You are going to be responding to the life story that you were asked to read before the workshop. If you didn't get a chance to, you can quickly just choose one of the life stories. The list of names is here, and you can go to the Padlet and the resources linked in there too. Okay, everybody, and we have 5 minutes left of our session this evening, and I had a look at some of your responses. So let's take a moment to just read through some of our colleagues' thoughts on the life story that they read. And if there's anything you wanted to also add into the chat that you didn't get a chance to say in the Padlet, you are welcome to do so. Okay. So feel free to add into the chat any particular things you that resonated with you about the story. I was just reading through the responses, and I think one of the big themes that I'm seeing from your reflections is that a lot of women made really difficult choices. Oh, oh no. Okay. Can you all see my slideshow again? Okay, good, great. I don't know what happened. But yes, women were making difficult choices, that there were some stories like Margaret Shippen, Peggy Arnold's was very privileged, whereas you have Peggy Gwynn, who, as someone said, enjoyed some freedom for a while in loyalist in British occupied New York, and then was not able to secure her freedom. I think Deborah Squash's story is also really incredible because on the opposite end, she did leave the new United States, and there is the ledger that was created by the British of every self-emancipated person who was able to leave. And then Nanyehi Nancy Ward, what choices is she making for the Cherokee Nation, and how did others feel about it? So there is a lot of complexities that came out just from reading your responses. Fantastic. And I hope that those stories were enlightening for all of you. I know I always learn a lot rereading them, but we are at the end of our time together. And so I just wanted to leave this on the screen. You have your workshop link stock with ways to hear more about WAMS, but if you have any thoughts about these two questions, you're welcome to write it out. And I think Laura's going to say a few words now too.
Yes, please go ahead and respond to those questions. But I just want to thank you so much, Marianne. This is just terrific. And I love the resource sheet. I think everybody will be able to gain a lot from that as they put it to work in their classroom. I wanted to remind everybody that we have many more wonderful webinars coming up this month and next. And you can find those if you go under webinars on ncheteach.org. And next week, or tomorrow night, in fact, we have a wonderful one entitled "What Are We Fighting For?" Teaching the Vietnam War through rock and roll music. So I hope you'll join us for that. And then next week, the New York Historical Society will be back with How We Became Modern, Industrialization, and the First World War. And you'll get a lot of great ways to bring that information to your classroom as well. And we thank you all for attending, and look forward to seeing you at future webinars.